Okay, welcome back. Sorry for that. All right, so when we last left off, we were talking about why is process so important, and I think I covered points 1 and 2. And point 3 is that by focusing on process, it often leads to artists being both more efficient, like really figuring out what are the most efficient, most productive ways of producing a body of work, but also more focus on quality control, strangely enough, by really making it about process and production rather than single product. You can actually get much better at controlling what your quality is. But probably the most important reason is number 4, which is for students, the most important thing they have to do, especially this is for studio students, but even for graphic design students, the most important thing they have to achieve is to actually make aesthetic progress, get from one aesthetic sort of place to another aesthetic place where their artwork has developed and improved. And the best way to do that is to produce a lot of work. And one of the best ways to produce a lot of work is to put a lot of emphasis on process so that you're not frozen up by trying to make each piece that you make the absolute best piece you ever could make. And instead, make it about developing your process so that you can make a lot more, and especially when you make your process very open-ended, so that you're not necessarily controlling exactly what the end result's going to be. It allows you to have a much more, make a lot more aesthetic progress, cover more ground, so to speak. And lastly, I would say it's for any artist, and especially a young art student, it's really important to examine process and concept and product so that you can really figure out exactly what's the right way of working for you. If you're only working the way you've always worked and never really examined or tried any other possibilities, then you don't really know what is the best set of processes for you. You just know, well, this is the way I've always done it. So, speaking about that, let's examine some different ways of developing ideas and developing bodies of work. And so here we have 3 or 4 what I would call dysfunctional kind of idea processes. Let's start with the bottom one, the A to B, which is the most common way people think about making a body of work. And the problem with this is that you're not considering any options, and you're just going directly to your first idea. And as many people know, art professors will tell art students all the time, your first idea is usually one of your weakest. So you're just going A to B and not trying much in the way of variation. The one that's at the top is a variation on that, where essentially you're creating possible options, but really what you're doing is you're just making, you had the set idea in mind, and you're just making a version of B that's just slightly different than the other version of B that's just slightly different from the other version of B. You're still basically just going A through B. And the one on the far right is dysfunctional because it appears like you're making progress. You're kind of going around circles, and you eventually do get to a B. But once again, you still haven't really considered any options. The one on the far left is probably the best of all of these options, because at least in this one, the person did explore a number of options before settling on B, but they didn't explore any of the options other than B very much at all. So here are some diagrams that would show a more... I got you. You're good. I got a cat struggling to walk. So here we have some examples of more functional ways of developing your ideas. And as you can see from each one of these, we have at the beginning stages trying lots of different options, and then once you get to your first option that you really go with, trying some more options based on that. And so based on each of these diagrams, you can see that the person is covering more ground, but also considering more options along the way, right? And that's what we want to do. We want to cover more ground, but get to more options. For those of you who don't know, the little wiggly line, the right at the end, like right before getting to B on the top one, that wiggly line is a little diagram notation that people use to represent refinement. so that when you're coming up with an idea, that kind of wiggle down to the last is like, this is the stage where you're really refining your idea. And so as you can see in the second one, the one on the bottom, where this is a person developing a studio body work, because it's a whole studio body work rather than like a design student, like a graphic designer working on just one project, since it's a whole body of work, there are much more stages of choosing options and also stages of refinement within the process as well as refinement at the end. Here's an sometimes studio bodies of work, and we talk about synthesis a lot in this class, and sometimes studio bodies of work really well when an artist is working on multiple tracks at the same time. If you're a studio artist, you don't necessarily only just make paintings and just the one kind of painting. You might make multiple kinds of paintings, or you make your paintings but you also make collage works and you also make drawings, and that those bodies of work might be slightly similar but also slightly different, and they become parallel tracks where you're developing ideas. But then the other thing that can happen is that sometimes those parallel tracks can come together into a refinement. Okay, so here are some examples of some artists who from the 60s onward who kind of exemplified these ideas of ways of thinking about process. These are artists who kind of fall into the anti-form kind of period, anti-form movement, and the post-minimalist movement. And so we have like artists like Linda Benglis, who I've talked about a couple of times already in this class, and I think makes very interesting work. They have a really, the piece down at the bottom, the aluminum piece, they have a version of that, a casting of that at the New Orleans Museum of Art. That's very nice. Let's pause just briefly to talk about some terms so that we are aware of how all this artwork kind of relates to each other. The anti-form movement basically is a catch-all phrase that represents a lot of artwork in the 60s where artists were trying to avoid making a finished thing, a finished work of art, like making an object. Instead, they were trying to find ways of making art where the sellable object is removed from the process. And so this can include artists who pursued performance art or artists who pursued different kinds of process art, but they were all trying in a way to avoid making stuff that could become a commodity. They were trying to avoid commodification. And the anti-form movement in some ways is part of this larger movement, which we might call the post-minimalist movement, of all these different artists trying to make work that was still influenced by the minimalist movement, but was not so boxed into the very simple and sterile quality of like the very end of the minimalist movement. I mean, basically, once Donald Judd is making those really simple stainless steel boxes, how much simpler can you go from that? So artists started to go beyond or try something different. So from these two, we have two kinds of art: process art and systems art. And process art in general, and you can kind of think of systems art as being a specific kind of process art. Process art is any kind of artwork where the artist is developing a process, a way of making, and putting a lot of design and thought into that first, and then following that process as much as possible rather than predetermining what the outlook of the artwork is going to be. Systems art is taking that idea and making that process extremely systematic, like down to the point where you write it out almost in the form of code. And when we talk about Sol LeWitt, we'll see how that comes out. So systems art, and then related to system art, we have things like systematic art, like we talked about with Frank Stella and Kenneth Nolan, or generative systems art, which is basically artwork that led to computer programming. And then lastly, related to all this is a whole nother movement that's kind of related, and that is the relational art movement, where artists who started thinking about process started also thinking about the process that artwork interacts with the audience, and making that planning of that interaction and that kind of planning it as kind of a performance or as an event, and thinking about the relational aspects of art to audience becomes the point. Okay, so that should help you kind of understand a little bit how these different artists are going to talk about. Now, all these are artists who worked in, these are kind of like late modernist or beginning postmodernist artists artists who worked in the 60s and 70s. So Barry Levant was